When I purchased that house, I believed I was simply starting over. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 months earlier, ending an 8-year marriage that collapsed under the weight of unspoken resentments and growing distance. I lost not just my wife, but our shared friends, our routines, and the future we had planned together. The house was modest but solid, a simple 2-bedroom in a quiet suburban development with a spacious backyard that had been neglected by the previous owners. I did not plan to become a gardener. It happened gradually, almost accidentally. The first weekend, I pulled a few weeds near the back patio, finding unexpected satisfaction in the simple physical labor. The following Saturday, I turned over a small patch of soil. By the end of the month, I had sketched plans for raised beds, a small greenhouse corner, and native flowering plants to attract butterflies and hummingbirds. There is something profoundly healing about working with soil. The way it feels between your fingers, the promise contained in each seed, the daily ritual of watering, tending, protecting new growth. My therapist would have called it mindfulness through action or something equally clinical. I just knew that for the first time since signing those divorce papers, I did not wake up with that familiar heaviness in my chest. Morning became my favorite time. I would rise with the sun, make coffee, and then step outside to lose myself among the plants for an hour before work. Summer arrived with blazing heat, and I adopted the habit of gardening shirtless in the privacy of my fenced backyard. The sun on my skin became another form of therapy, a connection to something elemental and honest that had been missing from my life. Most of my neighbors kept to themselves, which suited me perfectly. An elderly gentleman 2 doors down would occasionally wave when collecting his newspaper. A young couple with a toddler smiled politely when our paths crossed. I exchanged pleasantries with them, but otherwise maintained my solitude, content with the quiet companionship of growing things. Until I noticed her. I cannot pinpoint exactly when Karen began watching me. Her house bordered the left side of my property, with our fences meeting at a perpendicular angle that gave her kitchen window a partial view into my backyard. At first, it was just a sensation, that prickle at the back of your neck when you know you are being observed. Then I began catching glimpses, blinds suddenly shifting, a shadow moving away from the window when I looked up. Our first actual interaction occurred on a particularly hot Tuesday in July. I had been turning compost, shirtless and sweating in the morning heat, when I straightened up to find her standing at the corner where our fences met, arms crossed tightly over her floral blouse. "Good morning," I offered politely, reaching for my water bottle. Her lips pressed into a thin line before she responded. "You know, some people in this neighborhood have children and windows." I glanced down at my bare torso, confused by her implication. "I am sorry, is there a problem?" "Public indecency is actually against the law," she stated flatly, her eyes narrowing. "Just something to consider." She turned and walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there, garden fork in hand, utterly bewildered. I brushed off the encounter. Perhaps she was simply old-fashioned or overly concerned with propriety. It seemed a small matter, easily resolved by ignoring it. I returned to my compost, though the joy of the morning had diminished somewhat. As July turned to August, my garden flourished beyond my expectations. The tomato plants grew heavy with fruit. Zucchini threatened to overtake their allotted space. Marigolds blazed orange and yellow along the borders. What had begun as a distraction had transformed into something meaningful, tangible evidence that I could create something beautiful after loss. Each harvest felt like a small victory against the darkness that had threatened to engulf me after the divorce. I should have recognized the warning signs sooner. The way Karen would appear at her fence line whenever I was outside. The comments that grew increasingly pointed rather than diminishing. The way her gaze followed me with something beyond mere disapproval, something that resembled anticipation, as though she were waiting for me to make a mistake. But I was too focused on growth, on healing, on the daily miracle of my garden. Too preoccupied with rebuilding my life to notice that someone was already plotting to tear it down. The transition from uncomfortable encounters to outright harassment happened so gradually that I nearly missed it. The first formal notice arrived in my mailbox exactly 2 weeks after our fence line exchange, a white envelope with the Homeowners Association logo printed in the corner. Inside was a form letter citing multiple community complaints regarding activities conducted on my property that violate neighborhood standards of decorum. The letter did not specify what these activities might be, only that I should remedy the situation immediately to avoid further action. At the bottom, a handwritten note had been added. Perhaps a shirt would be appropriate for everyone's comfort. There was no signature, but the handwriting matched a community newsletter I had received earlier, created by Karen, the HOA secretary. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, unsettled, but still not fully comprehending what was beginning to unfold. That evening, I watched through my kitchen window as Karen walked past my house for the third time that day, her pace slowing as she approached, her head turning deliberately toward my property. The next morning, another note appeared. This one slipped directly into my mailbox without postage. Neighborhood children should not be exposed to inappropriate displays. This is your second warning. The implication was infuriating, transforming my simple act of gardening shirtless in my own private space into something unseemly or even predatory. I decided a direct conversation might clear the air. That afternoon, I walked to Karen's house and knocked on her front door. She answered wearing reading glasses and an expression of practiced surprise that did not reach her eyes. "I received some concerning notes," I began, keeping my voice even and pleasant. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding about my gardening habits, and I wanted to discuss it directly." Karen removed her glasses slowly, her posture stiffening. "There is no misunderstanding. You expose yourself in your yard regularly." "I garden without a shirt sometimes, yes, but that is hardly." "I have documented every instance," she interrupted, her voice taking on a performative quality slightly louder than our conversation required. "I have timestamps, photographs. You deliberately time your activities when you know I will be home." I stepped back, genuinely shocked by the accusation. "That is absolutely not true. I am simply gardening on my own property." "I know your type," she continued, her eyes narrowing. "Moving in here after your wife left you, thinking you can just do whatever you want." The mention of my divorce startled me. I had not discussed my personal life with anyone in the neighborhood. "I think this conversation is over," I said quietly. "Please stop leaving notes in my mailbox." "Or what?" Her smile never reached her eyes. "You will intimidate me like you are trying to do right now, standing on my porch making threats." "I have not threatened you, I just want." "You should watch yourself," she said, closing the door partially. "This is a respectable community. We have standards." The door closed completely, leaving me standing there, confused and increasingly concerned. The conversation had twisted into something unrecognizable, my attempts at resolution somehow transformed into evidence against me. As I walked home, the neighbor whose backyard adjoined mine on the right side approached cautiously. He introduced himself as Michael, a resident of 5 years, and asked if I had run into trouble with Karen yet. The question confirmed my growing suspicions. "She has taken an interest in my gardening habits," I replied carefully. Michael glanced toward Karen's house before lowering his voice. "You are not the first. The family before you left because of her. She does this find something, anything, and then makes it a crusade." "But why?" He shrugged. "Power, I guess. She has half the HOA board in her pocket. They do not want to cross her either." That evening, I began documenting everything, taking photographs of my yard, saving the notes Karen had left, recording dates and times of our interactions. I installed a small security camera facing my garden, not for protection against intruders, but against accusations. The following Saturday, I noticed a new addition to Karen's house, a security camera mounted under her eaves, pointed directly at my backyard. That same afternoon, she walked past my front yard 3 separate times, phone in hand, apparently taking pictures or videos. Despite this escalation, I continued my gardening, though now with a constant awareness of being watched, documented, judged. My garden, once a sanctuary, began to feel like a stage set for a performance I never agreed to give. The simple joy of working with plants was now tainted with anxiety and an increasing sense of violation. Karen was not simply a nosy neighbor. She was methodically building a case against me, creating a narrative of misconduct where none existed. And I was beginning to understand that she had done this before. The police arrived at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning in mid-August. I remember checking my watch when I heard the car doors slam, marking the exact moment when harassment escalated to something far more serious. I had been up since 6, enjoying the relative cool of early morning, watering the vegetable beds shirtless as had become my routine. The garden hose was still running, spraying an arc of water over the tomato plants when I heard Karen's voice, loud and theatrical from the direction of my driveway. That is him. That is exactly what he does every morning, exposing himself where everyone can see. I turned to find 2 police officers following Karen up my driveway, her arm extended and finger pointed directly at me. She had dressed for the occasion in a buttoned-up blouse despite the heat, her hair neatly styled, looking every bit the concerned citizen. I shut off the hose and reached for my t-shirt, which I had draped over the fence post. "Sir, could we speak with you for a moment?" The taller officer approached while his partner stayed back with Karen, who continued her narrative about my ongoing lewd behavior loudly enough for the entire street to hear. "Of course," I replied, pulling on my shirt and feeling a profound sense of humiliation wash over me. "What seems to be the problem?" "We have received a complaint about inappropriate behavior. Could I see some identification, please?" I nodded and walked to the patio table where my wallet lay beside my coffee mug. As I retrieved my driver's license, I could hear Karen's voice rising in pitch. "He does this deliberately, standing there half-naked, timing it so I have to see him when I am in my kitchen. It has been going on for months. Ask anyone in the neighborhood." The officer examining my license remained professional, but I could see the awkwardness in his expression. "Sir, are you aware that there have been complaints about you gardening without proper attire?" "I work in my garden shirtless sometimes, yes, in my fenced backyard, on my private property." I kept my voice level, though my heart was pounding. I was not aware that was against any law. The second officer approached, leaving Karen at the edge of my yard. "It is not necessarily against the law to be shirtless on your own property," he explained, "but we do need to address complaints when they involve allegations of deliberate exposure or harassment." "Harassment?" I repeated, genuinely confused. "Ms. Winters states that you deliberately position yourself to be visible from her home, and that you have made inappropriate gestures when you notice her looking." The accusation was so far removed from reality that I almost laughed, but the gravity of the situation prevented it. 2 police officers were standing in my yard. Neighbors were watching from windows and porches. This was no longer a private feud. "That is absolutely untrue," I said firmly. "I garden in the mornings before work. I have never made any inappropriate gestures toward anyone. In fact, Ms. Winters has been the one watching me, taking photographs and leaving threatening notes in my mailbox." I gestured toward my house. "I have documentation inside if you would like to see it." The officers exchanged a glance. The taller one handed back my license. "That will not be necessary right now. There is no law against gardening shirtless on your own property, but it might be easier for everyone if you would consider wearing a shirt while outside, even in your backyard." From the edge of the yard, Karen's voice cut through again. "So you are not going to do anything? He is going to get away with this. What if children see him?" The second officer turned to her. "Ma'am, as we explained, being shirtless on private property is not illegal. We cannot arrest someone for that. He is doing it to harass me, to make me uncomfortable in my own home." Her voice cracked with what sounded like practiced emotion. "Ma'am, please lower your voice," the officer responded. "We have addressed your complaint. If you have further concerns, you need to document specific instances of actual harassment, not just someone gardening on their own property." They left shortly after, but the damage was already done. Karen stormed away, phone in hand, undoubtedly documenting this interaction as well. Neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle slowly returned to their homes, and I was left standing in my garden, shirt now clinging to my sweaty skin, feeling violated in a way I had never experienced before. That evening, my phone began lighting up with text messages from numbers I did not recognize. Heard you had trouble with the neighborhood watch. Maybe get some curtains, lol. Karen strikes again. Word had spread throughout the development. I had become that neighbor, the one with the problem, the one police had to visit. My reputation was being rewritten by someone I barely knew, transformed from private divorcee, rebuilding his life into something unsavory and suspicious. I sat on my back patio that night, looking at the garden that had brought me so much healing, now tainted with this new anxiety. The automatic sprinkler system clicked on, spraying a fine mist over the plants. I would not be out there with the hose tomorrow morning. I could not risk another scene, another humiliation. Karen had succeeded in her first major escalation. She had brought law enforcement to my door. She had created a public spectacle. She had begun the process of isolating me in my own neighborhood. But she had also made a critical mistake. She had pushed me past the point of tolerance into the territory of resistance. I was done attempting to appease her or ignore the problem. It was time to fight back. The formal notice from the Homeowners Association arrived exactly 3 days after the police visit. The envelope was thicker than previous communications, containing a multi-page document with the HOA letterhead prominently displayed and an official meeting notification. Dear homeowner, it began, you are hereby notified of a formal complaint hearing regarding your property located at 1482 Oakwood Lane. Your presence is required at the Willow Creek Community Center on Thursday, August 24th at 7:00 p.m. Failure to appear may result in automatic findings against you and possible fines or liens against your property. The attached complaint form listed numerous alleged violations, each more absurd than the last. Repeated indecent exposure visible from neighboring properties, creating a hostile living environment for adjacent residents, deliberate intimidation tactics against community members, and multiple violations of community decency standards as outlined in Covenant Section 7.3. I immediately searched for my copy of the HOA covenants, which had been provided during my home purchase. Section 7.3 addressed exterior property maintenance and visual standards. There was nothing about appropriate attire or behavior, only landscaping requirements and prohibitions against excessive clutter. The hearing date gave me only 5 days to prepare. I spent the first evening researching HOA laws in our state, discovering that while homeowners associations held significant power, they were still bound by legal constraints. They could not create or enforce rules that were not explicitly stated in their governing documents. They could not selectively enforce rules against certain residents while ignoring others who committed the same violations. The following day, I took a personal day from work and drove to the county records office, requesting all publicly available documents related to the Willow Creek HOA. Among these records were meeting minutes from the past 3 years, which revealed a pattern that confirmed my growing suspicions. Karen Winters had filed formal complaints against 7 different homeowners during her 4 years on the board. 2 of those homeowners had subsequently sold their homes and moved. 3 others had received fines for violations that seemed minor or subjective. In each case, the board had voted in favor of Karen's complaints, with the president, Thomas Halford, consistently supporting her position. Further research revealed that Thomas and Karen had attended the same high school and appeared together in numerous community function photographs. Their connection appeared to extend beyond mere HOA business. Armed with this information, I began preparing for the hearing. I organized my documentation chronologically, photographs of my garden and property showing no violations, copies of Karen's notes and the HOA letters, a timeline of her escalating behavior, statements from 2 neighbors who had witnessed her frequent surveillance of my property, and records of the other complaints she had filed against community members. When the hearing night arrived, I dressed professionally in slacks and a button-down shirt, carrying a leather portfolio containing all my materials. The community center meeting room was arranged like a small courtroom, with a table at the front for the 5 board members and chairs facing them for other participants. Karen was already seated when I arrived, three large binders stacked on the table beside her. She did not acknowledge my presence, but I noticed how she straightened slightly, adjusting her posture to appear more vulnerable as I walked past. Thomas Halford called the meeting to order promptly at 7, introducing the board members and explaining the procedure. Karen would present her complaint first, followed by my response, then questions from the board, and finally deliberation and decision. Karen's presentation was a masterclass in manipulation. She approached the front table clutching her binders, her voice trembling slightly as she described feeling unsafe and violated in her own home due to my deliberate and ongoing inappropriate behavior. She presented printed photographs taken from her window, grainy, zoomed-in images of me gardening, the angles and distances carefully chosen to remove context and privacy barriers. "I have documented 57 separate incidents," she stated, producing a spreadsheet with dates and times. "Always when he knows I will be home, always positioned where my kitchen window cannot avoid the view." She described being forced to alter her routine and living in constant anxiety because of my exhibitionist behavior. She claimed to have spoken with me reasonably multiple times, only to be met with veiled threats and intimidation. The board members nodded sympathetically, particularly Thomas, who asked leading questions that allowed Karen to elaborate on her distress. When she finished her presentation, the room had been successfully tilted in her favor, my character thoroughly assassinated before I had spoken a single word. When my turn came, I approached calmly and thanked the board for the opportunity to address these allegations. "Before I begin my response," I said, "I would like to request a copy of the specific HOA rules that I have allegedly violated. Section 7.3, which was cited in the complaint, contains nothing about appropriate attire or behavior on private property. It addresses landscaping and exterior maintenance only." Thomas Halford shifted uncomfortably. "The spirit of the covenants clearly includes community standards of decency." "I am not questioning the spirit, but the letter of the rules," I replied. "If there is no specific prohibition against gardening shirtless on private property within a fenced yard, then there can be no violation." I then presented my documentation methodically, beginning with a satellite view of our properties that clearly showed the privacy fence and the limited angle from which Karen could actually see into my yard, an angle that required deliberate effort on her part. I showed the progression of her notes and communications, the installation of her camera pointed at my property, and statements from neighbors describing her walking past my house multiple times daily. I carefully avoided any personal attacks or emotional language, focusing solely on documented facts. Finally, I concluded, I would like to address the pattern of similar complaints filed by Ms. Winters against other homeowners in our community. I distributed copies of the public meeting minutes showing the 7 previous complaints. 2 of these homeowners ultimately sold their homes and moved away. I believe this demonstrates a pattern of targeted harassment rather than legitimate concerns about community standards. The room fell silent. Several board members glanced at each other uneasily. Karen's face had flushed deep red, her hands gripping her binder so tightly that her knuckles had whitened. Thomas attempted to regain control of the narrative. "These other cases are not relevant to the current complaint. They establish a pattern of behavior that is directly relevant," I countered. "They also raise questions about potential conflicts of interest in board decisions, given your long-standing personal relationship with Ms. Winters." The meeting deteriorated quickly after that revelation. Karen demanded that my slanderous accusations be stricken from the record. 2 board members began asking pointed questions about the specific rules I had violated. Thomas repeatedly attempted to steer the conversation back to community harmony and consideration for neighbors, rather than addressing the lack of specific violations. After nearly 2 hours, the board voted 3-2 to table the complaint pending review of covenant language. It was not a victory, but it was not the automatic finding against me that Karen had clearly expected. As I gathered my materials to leave, I noticed how the room had subtly divided. Karen and Thomas huddled together at one end, speaking in hushed tones, while the other board members avoided eye contact with both them and me. I had survived the first official attack, but I harbored no illusions that it would be the last. Karen had been publicly challenged, her tactics exposed. Thomas's leadership had been questioned. They would regroup and return with something stronger. Walking to my car in the darkened parking lot, I made a decision. It was time to stop playing defense. I needed legal representation, someone who understood HOA law and harassment cases. I would no longer face this alone. Finding the right attorney took 3 days of research and multiple consultations. I eventually retained Jessica Patel, a sharp-eyed lawyer who specialized in homeowner association disputes and had successfully handled several cases involving board overreach and targeted harassment. "What you are describing is unfortunately not uncommon," Jessica explained during our first meeting. "HOAs wield significant power in communities, and when that power concentrates in the hands of people with personal agendas, it can become weaponized against individual homeowners." She reviewed my documentation, occasionally nodding or making notes. "You have done an excellent job gathering evidence so far. The pattern of complaints against other homeowners is particularly valuable, but we need more." Jessica helped me develop a systematic approach to strengthening my case. First, we needed to establish a clear timeline of Karen's behavior, with documented evidence for each escalation. Second, we needed to connect with other homeowners who had experienced similar treatment. Third, we needed to thoroughly review the HOA governing documents to identify any potential procedural violations in how my case had been handled. I took another day off work and spent it canvassing the neighborhood, carefully approaching homes where I believed previous targets of Karen's campaigns might have lived. Many doors remained closed when I introduced myself. Community members were reluctant to get involved, fearful of becoming the next target, but a few were willing to talk. The Rodriguezes, who lived 3 streets over, described a 6-month campaign of harassment after they installed a basketball hoop in their driveway. Karen claimed it violated sight lines and created noise pollution, Mr. Rodriguez explained. The hoop was completely within regulations, but she filed complaint after complaint. Eventually, we removed it just to make the harassment stop. A widow named Alina Parker tearfully recounted being targeted after her husband's death when her lawn maintenance lapsed during her grieving period. "She left nastygrams on my door every day, called the HOA repeatedly, even called the city to report me. I was burying my husband of 40 years, and all she cared about was that my grass was half an inch too long." Most significantly, I located the Johnson family, who had sold their home at a loss specifically to escape Karen's relentless campaign against them. They had moved to an entirely different district, but agreed to provide a written statement detailing 2 years of escalating harassment that began when they painted their front door a shade of blue that Karen deemed inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics, despite it being on the approved color palette. "She made our lives hell," Mrs. Johnson told me over the phone. "Complaints to the HOA, calls to the police. Rumors spread to neighbors. She even contacted my husband's workplace anonymously to report that he was harassing her. We lost friends, sleep, peace of mind. The only solution was to leave." Armed with these testimonials, Jessica filed a formal harassment complaint with the county court and sent cease and desist letters to both Karen and the HOA board. The letters detailed the pattern of harassment, the lack of supporting evidence for her accusations, and the apparent conspiracy between her and certain board members to target specific homeowners. The legal standard for harassment in this state includes a knowing and willful course of conduct directed at a specific person that seriously alarms, annoys, or harasses the person, and that serves no legitimate purpose, Jessica explained. Ms. Winters's behavior clearly meets that standard. The cease and desist letters had an immediate impact. The HOA board announced that the complaint against me had been dismissed, pending further review of covenant language. Karen's daily walks past my house stopped abruptly. The camera pointed at my backyard was repositioned to face her own property instead. For 3 days, I experienced a welcome respite from the constant surveillance and harassment. I even ventured into my garden again, though now always wearing a shirt despite the August heat, unwilling to provide any new ammunition. Then came her counterattack. I was returning from work on Friday evening when a police car pulled up beside me in my driveway. The same officers who had responded to Karen's previous complaint stepped out, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Mr. Mitchell, we have received another complaint from Ms. Winters," the taller officer began. "She alleges that you confronted her at the community mailboxes this morning and made threatening statements." I stared at them in disbelief. "That is impossible. I was at work all day. I have not seen Ms. Winters in person since the HOA hearing last week." "She provided a written statement claiming you said, and I quote, 'You will regret what you have done to me and that you blocked her path, preventing her from leaving the mailbox area.' That is a complete fabrication. I can provide time-stamped security footage from my office showing I was there from 7:30 a.m. until 6:15 p.m. today. I have not been to the community mailboxes in 3 days." The officers exchanged glances. "We would appreciate seeing that footage, sir. This is becoming a complex situation." I invited them inside and pulled up the office security feed on my laptop, which clearly showed me at my desk throughout the day. I also provided my supervisor's contact information for verification. The officers thanked me and prepared to leave. "You might want to document these interactions as well," the shorter officer advised quietly. "This situation appears to be escalating in a concerning direction." After they left, I immediately called Jessica to update her on this latest development. She was not surprised. "This is textbook escalation," she explained. "Your legal response threatened her, so she is upping the ante with false criminal accusations. She is trying to provoke you into an emotional reaction that she can use against you." "What do we do now?" "We accelerate our timeline. I will file for an emergency restraining order first thing Monday morning. In the meantime, document everything, avoid any contact with her, and consider installing additional security cameras to protect yourself against further false accusations." That weekend was the longest of my life. I stayed inside, afraid to even step into my backyard. My garden, once my sanctuary, now felt like a trap. I installed 2 additional security cameras covering my driveway and front yard, and another facing the street to document Karen's movements near my property. Monday morning, Jessica filed for the emergency restraining order based on the pattern of harassment and false police reports. By Wednesday, we had a court date scheduled for the following week. We also filed a formal complaint with the police department about Karen's false report. The legal wheels were now in motion. What had begun as a neighbor's strange fixation on my gardening habits had evolved into a legal battle with significant consequences for all involved. Karen had pushed too far, crossing the line from nuisance to criminal liability with her false police report. I remained scrupulously calm, documenting everything, following Jessica's advice to the letter. But inside, determination had replaced fear. Karen had tried to destroy my peace, my reputation, and potentially my freedom with her false accusations. Now she would face the consequences of her actions in a forum where her manipulation tactics would find no purchase. The courtroom would not be swayed by performative victimhood or neighborhood politics. Justice would be determined by facts, evidence, and law, and in that arena I knew we would prevail. The county courthouse stood imposingly against the clear September sky, its stone steps already warming in the morning sun as Jessica and I approached. We arrived 45 minutes early to review our strategy one final time before the hearing. Karen and her attorney, a thin man with nervous hands and an ill-fitting suit, were already seated in the hallway outside the courtroom, pointedly avoiding eye contact as we passed. "Remember," Jessica murmured as we took seats at the opposite end of the hallway, "let her play the victim. The more theatrical she becomes, the more it will contrast with the evidence. Judge Reynolds has a reputation for seeing through performance to facts." Inside the courtroom, the physical separation between us felt symbolic of the larger divide that had developed. Karen sat with her attorney at one table, a collection of binders and folders arranged before her in meticulous rows. Jessica and I occupied the opposing table, our evidence organized chronologically in a single comprehensive portfolio. Judge Madeline Reynolds entered promptly at 9 o'clock, a stern-faced woman with shrewd eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they observed. After the preliminaries, she turned to Corinne's attorney. "Counsel, please present your client's position in this matter." What followed was a performance worthy of a daytime drama. Corinne's attorney described me as a calculated harasser who had engaged in a pattern of indecent and intimidating behavior designed to make Corinne feel unsafe in her own home. Corinne herself took the stand with visible trepidation, her voice quavering as she recounted the trauma of seeing me working shirtless in my garden. "He knew exactly what he was doing," she testified, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "He timed it perfectly so I would see him from my kitchen window while preparing breakfast. Every single morning. It was deliberate. When I finally had the courage to speak up, he became threatening." Her attorney produced the photographs she had taken, the same grainy, contextless images from the HOA hearing. "My client was forced to document these incidents for her own protection," he explained. "She felt unsafe, violated, targeted." Corinne described the alleged confrontation at the community mailboxes in vivid detail, details that were entirely fabricated but delivered with such conviction that they almost seemed plausible. "He blocked my path, loomed over me, said I would regret what I had done to him. I feared for my safety." Throughout her testimony, I maintained a neutral expression, making occasional notes as Jessica had advised. When Corinne's attorney concluded, Judge Reynolds turned to us. "Counsel for the respondent, your cross-examination." Jessica approached the witness stand with calm purpose. "Ms. Winters, you testified that Mr. Mitchell deliberately exposed himself in his garden at times when you would be in your kitchen. Is that correct?" "Yes, absolutely, every morning." "And you took photographs to document this behavior?" "I had no choice. I needed evidence." Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "Your Honor, I would like to present Exhibit A." She displayed a large aerial photograph of our adjacent properties. "This is a satellite image showing the positioning of both properties and the privacy fence between them." She turned back to Corinne. "Ms. Winters, based on this image, would you please show the court exactly which window of your home provides a view into Mr. Mitchell's backyard?" Corinne pointed to her kitchen window. "And would you agree that this window is positioned such that you would need to be standing directly beside it, looking at a specific angle, to see into Mr. Mitchell's yard beyond the privacy fence?" "I was in my kitchen. I could not avoid seeing." "Please answer the question, Ms. Winters. Does viewing Mr. Mitchell's yard require you to be at a specific position at your window?" "I suppose so, yes." "Thank you." Jessica displayed a new exhibit. "These are stills from Mr. Mitchell's security camera showing your movements on August 12th. Can you explain why you appear to be standing at your kitchen window with binoculars at 6:45 a.m.? A murmur ran through the courtroom. Corinne shifted uncomfortably. "That is not what the image shows." "Your Honor, we have enhanced images that clearly show Ms. Winters using binoculars to observe Mr. Mitchell's property on multiple occasions." Jessica presented the enhanced photographs. "Ms. Winters, if Mr. Mitchell's gardening was so offensive to you, why did you go to such lengths to observe it?" "I was documenting his behavior. Someone had to protect the neighborhood." Jessica continued methodically, establishing through Corinne's own contradictory testimony that she had engaged in systematic surveillance of my property, had installed cameras specifically to monitor my activities, and had initiated contact on multiple occasions rather than avoiding the behavior she claimed was so distressing. "Now, regarding the alleged confrontation at the community mailboxes," Jessica continued, "you testified that Mr. Mitchell threatened you on Friday, August 25th at approximately 10:15 a.m. Is that correct?" "Yes," Corinne answered firmly. "He cornered me and threatened me." "Your Honor, I would like to present Exhibit G," Jessica stated, producing a folder of documents. "These are time-stamped security records from Mr. Mitchell's workplace, showing his badge entry at 7:32 a.m. and his presence at his desk throughout the day, including during the time of the alleged confrontation." She placed a laptop on the evidence table. Additionally, we have security footage from his office building showing Mr. Mitchell in a department meeting during the exact time Ms. Winters claims he was threatening her at the community mailboxes. The video played clearly on the screen, me sitting in a conference room surrounded by colleagues, my face visible, timestamp showing 10:17 a.m. on August 25th. Ms. Winters, Jessica continued after the video concluded, how do you explain this contradiction? Corinne's composure finally cracked. He must have altered the timestamp, or had someone else record it. He is trying to make me look crazy. Your Honor, Jessica responded calmly. We have submitted affidavits from Mr. Mitchell's supervisor and 3 colleagues confirming his presence at this meeting, as well as official security logs from the building management company. Judge Reynolds leaned forward. Ms. Winters, are you suggesting that multiple individuals, including a corporate security system, conspired to create a false alibi for Mr. Mitchell? Corinne looked desperately toward Thomas Halford, who had been sitting in the back of the courtroom. I know what happened. I was there. Ms. Winters, the judge stated firmly, please answer the question before the court. He threatened me. He has been harassing me for months. Her voice had risen significantly, the practiced vulnerability replaced by genuine agitation. Jessica continued her methodical dismantling of Corinne's testimony, presenting one piece of contradictory evidence after another. She introduced statements from former neighbors describing similar campaigns of harassment. She showed the timeline of escalating actions and the correlation between my legal responses and Corinne's increasingly serious accusations. Finally, she played the audio recording of Corinne's police report regarding the fictional mailbox confrontation, a recording in which Corinne could be heard calmly and deliberately constructing a narrative that she now testified had left her terrified and traumatized. By the time Jessica concluded her cross-examination, Corinne was visibly flustered, her testimony in tatters. When it was my turn to testify, I spoke plainly and directly, describing my gardening habits, my attempts to address Corinne's concerns respectfully, and the escalating harassment I had experienced. I never sought conflict with Ms. Winters or anyone else in the neighborhood, I explained. I moved there seeking peace after a difficult divorce. My garden became my therapy, my way of rebuilding. When the harassment began, I tried to be accommodating. I tried to understand her concerns. When that failed, I sought to resolve the matter through proper channels. At no point did I threaten, intimidate, or deliberately make Ms. Winters uncomfortable. Thomas Halford was called as a witness for Corinne, but his testimony only strengthened our case. Under Jessica's skilled cross-examination, he admitted to his long-standing personal relationship with Corinne and his role in fast-tracking her complaints against multiple homeowners while serving as HOA president. He conceded that no specific HOA rule prohibited gardening shirtless on private property, and that the board had never taken action against other male residents who mowed their lawns without shirts or sunbathed in their yards. By the time closing arguments concluded, the momentum had shifted dramatically. Judge Reynolds sat silently for several moments, reviewing her notes before delivering her ruling. Based on the preponderance of evidence presented, this court finds that Ms. Winters has engaged in a persistent pattern of harassment against Mr. Mitchell without legitimate cause or purpose. The requested restraining order is granted. Ms. Winters is hereby ordered to maintain a distance of at least 100 feet from Mr. Mitchell, his home, and his workplace. She continued, her tone hardening slightly. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for review regarding the filing of a false police report, which is a serious criminal offense. Ms. Winters, this court strongly advises you to seek professional help regarding your obsessive behaviors. Corinne sat stunned, her carefully constructed narrative of victimhood completely dismantled. Her attorney looked equally shaken, gathering his materials haphazardly as the judge continued. Additionally, the court orders Ms. Winters to pay Mr. Mitchell's legal fees in this matter and damages in the amount of $15,000 for emotional distress and reputational harm. A public retraction of all false statements made against Mr. Mitchell must be posted in the community newsletter within 30 days. As we left the courtroom, I felt an overwhelming sense of vindication mixed with lingering disbelief that the situation had escalated to such extremes. Karen rushed past us without looking back, Thomas hurrying after her with repeated glances over his shoulder as if fearing we might follow. Jessica squeezed my shoulder gently. "Congratulations! This is a comprehensive victory. The damages and fee awards are higher than average for cases like this." Judge Reynolds clearly saw through the manipulation. "What happens now?" I asked as we descended the courthouse steps. "Now," she replied with a small smile, "you go home and garden in peace." The aftermath of the court ruling unfolded gradually over the following weeks, like the slow changing of seasons. Karen's immediate response was to retreat entirely from public view. Her curtains remained drawn day and night. Her car left early and returned late. The surveillance camera that had once been aimed at my property disappeared from her eaves. 2 days after the hearing, a certified letter arrived from the HOA board. It contained a formal apology for procedural irregularities in handling complaints against my property and notification that Thomas Halford had resigned as board president, effective immediately. The remaining board members had voted unanimously to conduct an independent review of all complaint procedures and past actions taken under the previous leadership. The legal victory, while satisfying, was only the beginning of a deeper healing for both me and the community. As news of the court ruling spread through the neighborhood, people who had kept their distance now approached with cautious smiles and tentative conversation. "We never believed what she was saying about you," Mrs. Davis from across the street confided one evening as I was checking my mailbox. "But we were all afraid of becoming her next target. She has been doing this for years." Michael, who had first warned me about Karen, brought over a six-pack of beer and sat with me on my front porch. "Thomas has resigned from the HOA completely," he informed me. "Apparently, the board is reviewing every complaint Karen filed during her time as secretary. There are a lot of apology letters going out." A week after the ruling, I ventured back into my garden early one morning. I hesitated briefly before removing my shirt, the memory of months of harassment still fresh. But the sun felt warm against my skin, the soil cool between my fingers. This was my space, my sanctuary. I would not allow lingering fear to taint it. As I worked among the tomato plants, I noticed movement at the fence line. A young couple stood there, the ones with the toddler I had occasionally seen but rarely spoken with. "We wanted to apologize," the woman called out tentatively. "We heard what happened, with Karen and everything. We should have said something when we saw her taking pictures of your yard. We just did not want to get involved." "It is all right," I assured them. "I understand." "Your garden is amazing," her husband added. "Our little one loves vegetables. Maybe you could give us some tips sometime." That small interaction became the first of many. As summer faded into autumn, the invisible barriers that had existed between houses began to dissolve. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact now stopped to chat. Children who had been hurried past my property now paused to watch butterflies visiting the flowering plants along my fence. The formal community meeting to revise HOA complaint procedures drew the largest attendance in the development's history. The new board president, a retired judge who had moved to the neighborhood just 6 months earlier, instituted a complete overhaul of the system. All complaints would now require specific citation of violated rules, objective evidence, and review by multiple board members with no personal connection to either party. "What happened to Mr. Mitchell should never have occurred," he stated firmly to the assembled residents. "This community should be a place where people feel safe and supported, not targeted and harassed." Karen did not attend the meeting. Rumors circulated that she had listed her house for sale, though no sign had yet appeared in her yard. The required public retraction was printed in the community newsletter, a terse 3 sentences acknowledging that accusations made against me were without factual basis and offering a formal apology for any harm caused. As ordered by the court, she maintained her distance. On the rare occasions when I glimpsed her walking to her car or collecting mail, she would immediately alter her course to maintain the required 100 feet of separation. There was no more photography, no more stalking, no more harassment. One unexpected outcome of the ordeal was the interest it generated in gardening throughout the neighborhood. Several neighbors asked for advice on starting their own vegetable patches. The HOA board approved a community garden in a previously unused common area. I was asked to help design the layout and provide guidance to those new to gardening. "You turned something terrible into something beautiful," Jessica commented when I called to update her on developments. "That is no small achievement." As autumn deepened, my garden offered its final harvest of the season. I shared tomatoes, peppers, and herbs with neighbors who now greeted me by name. I prepared the beds for winter, planting cover crops to enrich the soil for next year's growth. On a crisp October morning, I received an email from a gardening blog I followed occasionally. The editor had heard about my story through social media and asked if I would write an article about gardening through adversity. The piece would focus not on the harassment, but on how working with plants had provided stability and healing during a difficult time. I sat on my back patio, looking out over the garden that had become so much more than rows of vegetables and flowers. It had been my refuge during divorce, my battleground during harassment, and now, somehow, it had become a bridge connecting me to a community I had never expected to join. The article I wrote began simply, "Gardens teach us that growth often requires disturbance. Seeds must be buried before they can sprout. Soil must be turned to remain vital. Our lives follow similar patterns. Sometimes, the very challenges that threaten to uproot us instead force us to grow deeper, stronger roots." 2 weeks after the article was published online, I received an email from a man in Arizona describing a similar campaign of harassment he was experiencing from a neighbor. "Your story gave me courage," he wrote. "I have been afraid to fight back, but now I know it is possible to win." As winter approached, Corinne's house finally displayed a "for sale" sign. She moved out quietly one weekend without goodbyes or acknowledgments. The new owners, a family with teenage children, arrived with energy and enthusiasm, immediately introducing themselves to everyone on the street. "We heard this neighborhood has a great community garden," the father mentioned when we first met. "We would love to participate in the spring." The following April, as new growth emerged in my garden and throughout the neighborhood, I reflected on the strange journey of the past year. What began as one person's inexplicable fixation had ultimately strengthened an entire community. The HOA now functioned as it should, protecting property values while respecting individual rights. Neighbors knew each other's names and waved across lawns. Children played freely between houses. My garden flourished in its second full season, expanded now to include flowering native plants that attracted bees and butterflies. I still worked shirtless on hot mornings, feeling the sun on my skin without anxiety or self-consciousness. Sometimes neighbors would stop by the fence to chat or ask questions about plant care, completely unbothered by my attire or lack thereof. The divorce that had initially driven me to this house now seemed like a distant chapter in my life. The garden had healed me, then been weaponized against me, and finally had become a symbol of resilience and community. As I knelt in the warm soil, planting tomato seedlings in neat rows, I realized that Corinne had unintentionally given me something precious. In trying to isolate me, she had connected me to an entire community. In attempting to drive me from my sanctuary, she had ultimately expanded it beyond my fence line to encompass the whole neighborhood. Sometimes justice comes not just in court victories and financial settlements, but in the quiet triumph of a community healing itself, one garden row at a time.